Her father pulled bread from the masonry oven and set the loaves on a board. Then he took her hand, she was 7, and pressed her palm flat against the wall where the fire had been. The brick was warm, not hot. Warm the way something alive is warm, giving back heat from deep inside the stone. Flour dust floated in the lamplight. He said a small fire could fill a large stone if the stone had nowhere to spend it. She filed the lesson under comfort and forgot it for 17 years. Until the morning she knelt in a frozen mining camp with no shelter, no money, and no way out, and the memory came back with a weight her father never intended. Maren Vangen had been a wife for 11 months, and a widow for 2 days when the mine agent told her to leave the bunkhouse kitchen by morning. She was 24, Norwegian-born, brought to Wisconsin as an infant, raised on a dairy claim that failed, married in Sioux Falls to a man named Anders, who said Dakota Territory had work for anyone willing to swing a hammer underground. Anders had been willing. The Iron Creek Reduction Works hired him through a subcontractor named Garrett, who supplied day labor to the hoist crews. Day labor meant no company housing. It meant a shared bunk in a boarding room above the stamp mill, meals taken in the bunkhouse kitchen where Maren earned their keep by washing shirts for the crew at 3 cents apiece. It meant no widow's benefit when the hoist cable snapped, and Anders fell 40 feet into a shaft collar on a Tuesday morning in November. The mine agent was a thin man named Polk, who kept records in a canvas ledger and did not look at her when he spoke. Anders owed $9 to the boarding house for back rent. He owed $4 to the company store for flour, salt pork, and a wool cap he had bought the week before he died. The boarding room was tied to his wage. The wage had stopped. Polk said these words standing in the kitchen doorway, while Maren held a shirt in gray wash water, her knuckles split from lie, and the arithmetic settled over her like the cold draft that came through the gap where the stovepipe met the wall. She had $6.20 in coin. She owed 13. She owned 1 trunk, 1 wool blanket, 2 dresses, a cracked coffee pot, a hand Bible, a washboard, and Anders's brass work tag, the stamped disc the company used to track which men were underground. Polk had placed it on the kitchen table without ceremony, the way a man sets down a spent cartridge. The storekeeper, Ruel Marden, held her trunk receipt as debt security. She could not retrieve her belongings without settling the $4. She could not settle $4 because she had $6.20 and owed $9 to the boarding house first. The railroad spur was snowed past the junction at Elk Point. She had no relatives in Dakota. She had no relatives anywhere who could send money in time. Walking south meant open prairie in winter with no destination. Walking north meant the Black Hills, where a woman alone carried a different kind of danger. There was no door to walk through. Every direction was a wall. The morning Polk removed her from the kitchen, the temperature sat at 11 degrees and falling. Coal smoke pressed flat against the gulch floor because the air was too heavy and too still to lift it. Maren stood in the yard between the stamp mill and the ore shed with her washboard under one arm and her coffee pot in the other, and the town of Iron Creek, such as it was, did not pause. Ore carts rolled. Men crossed the frozen mud between the shaft house and the assay office. A dog nosed at a frozen scrap pile. No one spoke to her because widows without means were not unusual in mining camps, and the protocol was simple. They left. They found passage to Sioux Falls or Yankton or wherever a church basement would take them in. They did not remain. Maren remained. She remained because leaving required money she did not have, transport that did not exist, and a destination she could not name. She remained because Marden held her trunk, and Polk had closed the kitchen, and the ore shed foreman said she could sleep one night on the plank floor if she was gone by dawn. One night. She had purchased one night of shelter with the last of her willingness to ask. That first night she did not sleep. She sat against the ore shed wall with her blanket over her shoulders and her coffee pot between her boots, and she listened to the wind work through the gaps in the planking. The shed was 12 feet by 20, open at one end where ore carts backed in, and the cold entered like water filling a bowl. By midnight, her feet had gone numb. By 3 in the morning, she was shaking badly enough that her teeth hurt. She understood, in the way that only a body understands, that a second night like this would be dangerous, and a third might be fatal. At first light, she walked. Not south toward the railroad, not north toward the hills. She walked west along the ore cart track, past the collapsed timber racks and the stripped charcoal bins, toward the abandoned smelter yard that sat on a raised bench above the creek. The smelter had failed 2 years earlier when cheaper coke shipped by rail undercut local charcoal. What remained was wreckage. A roofless assay shed, rusted iron fittings half buried in frozen mud, broken sorting screens, and a row of 5 beehive kilns built from firebrick and local stone. The kilns were massive, 28 feet across at the base, roughly 24 feet high, domed like bread ovens scaled for giants. They had been built to convert timber into charcoal, sealed chambers where wood burned slow and hot with limited air until it became fuel dense enough to smelt ore. Each kiln had 2 low iron draft doors at the base, a charging hatch near the crown for loading wood from above, and a brick floor blackened from years of controlled burns. They were modeled on the beehive charcoal kilns used across the American West, the same design that fed smelters in Death Valley and Piedmont, Wyoming, structures built to hold tremendous heat inside thick masonry walls. Myron had walked past these kilns every week for 11 months, carrying shirts to the drying line. She had never thought about them. They were ruins, failures, evidence that Iron Creek's ambitions had outrun its ore. But that morning, standing in front of the nearest kiln with her breath smoking and her fingers aching, she did something she had never done before. She crouched at the draft door and looked inside. The interior was dark. Soot coated everything. Old ash and glass slag from the final burns covered the floor in a crust that cracked under her boot. But the wind noise changed. Outside, the air cut through her dress and pressed against her chest. Inside the draft door, 6 inches past the threshold, the cutting edge dulled. The air was still cold. She was not imagining warmth, but the violence of it stopped. The kiln's walls were 3 feet thick at the base. The dome overhead curved the wind away. The draft doors were low enough that ground-level gusts passed over them. She reached in to retrieve a button that had pulled loose from her sleeve and fallen into the ash. Her hand scraped the floor. Under the soot, the brick was hard, dense, and dry. Not warm, she was honest about that, but not frozen. The ground outside had frost 2 inches deep. The kiln floor had none. Maren pulled her hand back and looked at her fingertips. Gray with ash. Dry. And her mind delivered a memory so specific it startled her. She was 7 years old standing in a bakehouse in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Her father, Tolif Vangin, pulled bread from a masonry oven and set the loaves on a board. Then he pressed her hand flat against the oven wall. The fire had been out for an hour. The brick was warm, not hot enough to burn, warm the way a sleeping animal is warm, giving heat back slowly from somewhere deep inside the stone. Her father said, "A small fire can fill a large stone if the stone has nowhere to spend it." She had not understood the words then. She had understood the feeling, warm brick under her palm, rye steam in the air, flour dust caught in lamplight. A child's memory filed under comfort, not survival. Now, crouching at the mouth of an abandoned charcoal kiln with no shelter, no money, no stove, and no man to cut wood, the memory returned with a different weight. Her father had not been teaching science. He had been teaching her what stone could do. She pressed her hand against the kiln's interior wall. Cold, but dry, and thick enough to hold something if she could put it there. The question formed before she had language for it. If this kiln was built to contain fire so fierce it turned wood to charcoal, could it contain a fire small enough to keep one woman alive? The answer was not obvious. It was not even safe. The kilns were designed for airflow, massive volumes of controlled air feeding combustion. Living inside one with a fire meant contending with smoke, carbon, and the possibility of suffocation. The draft doors existed to feed the burn. The crown hatch existed to release gases. Every opening that made the kiln work as an industrial tool made it dangerous as a shelter. But Maren understood something that the men who built the kilns had not needed to consider. They had wanted air to move through. She needed air to stay still. The charcoal process depended on controlled airflow. Her survival depended on stopping it. If she could seal the draft openings, if she could control the crown hatch, if she could bank a tiny fire on the brick floor, not a roaring blaze, but coals, embers, heat pressed into stone the way her father pressed bread heat into the bakehouse wall. The massive masonry shell might absorb that heat and give it back slowly through the night. Dense brick held warmth the way wood never could. A plank cabin lost heat through every crack, every nail hole, every gap where wind found purchase. Brick 3 feet thick had no cracks. It had mass, and mass, her father's hand on hers had taught her, was a kind of patience. The logic was not complete. She knew that. She knew it the way a person standing at the edge of water knows they can probably swim to the other side, but cannot be certain until they are in the middle and it is too late to go back. She also knew that every other option was already closed. She could not build a cabin. A survivable winter cabin needed walls, a roof tight enough to hold snow load, a working stove, stovepipe, and at least 6 cords of dry wood stacked before deep winter. A cast iron stove cost $14, more than twice what she had. A cord of split wood sold at $3.50 because the hills around Iron Creek had been cut hard for mine timbers and charcoal fuel, and what remained was either green, small, or claimed. She had no saw. She had no axe. She had no team to drag logs and no skill to notch them if she did. She could not buy passage out. She could not work her way to spring in the ore shed. She could not beg shelter from the town because Iron Creek had no church, no charitable society, and no tradition of keeping people who could not keep themselves. The kiln was ridiculous. It was soot black, open to the wind through 2 iron doors covered in bird droppings and shaped like a burial mound. No sane person would look at it and see a home. Maren saw the only walls thick enough to matter. She spent that first day inside the kiln on her hands and knees, learning it. The floor was the first problem. Years of charcoal production had left a crustophyte, glass slag formed when mineral impurities in the wood melete at high temperatures. Beneath the slag, the original brick floor was intact but uneven, sloped toward the draft doors to allow ash removal. She would need to clear the slag, level a sleeping area, and create a zone for fire that would not send embers rolling toward her bedding. The draft doors were the second problem. Each was an iron plate roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, hinged at the top and propped open with iron rods. They had been designed to swing wide for loading and close partially for burning. The hinges were rusted but functional. The gaps around each door, where years of heat had warped the iron away from the brick frame, were wide enough to slide a hand through. Every gap was a channel for wind. The crown hatch was the third problem. 12 feet above her head, a square opening roughly 2 feet across allowed charcoal makers to load wood from above and vent gases during burns. It was covered with a rusted iron plate that no longer seated properly. Even with the plate in place, she could see daylight through the gap. Wind entering the crown and exiting the draft doors would create a chimney effect. Exactly what charcoal production required and exactly what would kill her if she tried to sleep with a fire burning below. She cataloged these problems on her knees in the dark, running her fingers along mortar joints, testing iron fittings, scraping soot with a broken piece of sorting screen she had found in the yard. She had no paper. She had no tools beyond what the wreckage offered. She memorized by touch. By afternoon, she had a plan that was more desperation than engineering. Seal the draft doors with clay from the creek bank. Pack the gaps with ash and horsehair scavenged from the livery waste pile. Repair the crown hatch with scrap tin from the collapsed assay shed so she could open and close it from below. Build a fire zone at the center of the floor using the densest bricks she could find. Build a sleeping platform above floor level, above the cold air that pooled low and below the smoke that gathered high. Test with small fires. Measure by whether water froze beside her cot. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan she had. She was still inside the kiln when Hiram Doxey found her. Doxey was 59, former Army quartermaster turned mine yard foreman. He had spent 30 years managing supply logistics, counting blankets, calculating firewood consumption per man per week, estimating how many days a detachment could survive on what provisions remained. He had come to Iron Creek because the mine paid better than the Army pension and because he was a man who liked problems that could be solved with arithmetic. The problem of Marin Vangen could not be solved with arithmetic, and this irritated him. He stood at the draft door, blocking the gray light, and looked at her kneeling on the slag-covered floor with soot on her face and her sleeves rolled to the elbows. "Mrs. Vangen," he said, "what are you doing in this kiln?" "Living," she said. He did not laugh. Doxy was not a man who laughed at things he found foolish. He found them irritating, and his irritation came out as inventory. "This structure," he said, stepping inside and looking up at the dome, "was built to burn 30 cords of wood at a time. It breathes through those doors and that hatch. You seal them, you suffocate. You leave them open, you freeze. You build a fire large enough to heat this space. You need a stove you cannot afford and a chimney this building does not have." "I'm not going to heat the space," Marin said. "Then what are you going to heat?" "The walls." Doxy stared at her. Then he walked the circumference of the interior, pressing his palm against the brick at intervals the way a man checks a horse for heat in the joints. He tapped mortar with his knuckle. He crouched at the floor slope and examined the drain channel. He looked up at the crown hatch and judged the gap with a quartermaster's eye. "You have half a structure," he said. "You have 2 draft doors that do not seal, a hatch that does not close, and a floor designed to move ash, not hold a bed. You have no stove, no pipe, and no fuel supply. To make this livable by any standard I recognize, you would need a sealed door, a venting system, a raised floor, insulation, and at least 4 cords of dry wood. You have none of these things." "I have the walls," Marin said. "Walls do not keep people alive, Mrs. Vangen. Heat keeps people alive. You have no source of heat." "I have brick that is 3 feet thick. I have a floor that is drier than the ground outside. And I have 2 hands." Doxy put his hat back on. "I have watched people die from confidence in a plan that ignores mathematics. I will say it plainly. You cannot survive a Dakota winter in a charcoal kiln with no stove and no firewood. If you remain here past December, you will freeze or suffocate. I am telling you this not because I am cruel, but because I am correct." He offered her one more night in the ore shed. She declined. He walked back toward the mine yard without looking over his shoulder, and Marin heard his boots crunch on the frozen mud until the sound faded into the stamp mill's rhythmic pounding. She stood alone inside the kiln. The dome rose above her like the inside of a dark skull. Wind whispered through the gaps she had not yet sealed. Doxy's math was sound. She knew it. A cabin required a stove, pipe, walls, roof, and wood, resources she could not obtain. But Doxy's math assumed a cabin. It assumed the only shelter that counted was the kind men built with saws and nails and iron hauled by wagon. It did not account for a shelter that already existed, that had been built by masons to contain temperatures far beyond anything a Dakota winter could produce, and that stood abandoned because no one had thought to ask what else it could become. Her doubt was real. It sat in her chest like a stone, but the doubt was about whether she could do it, not whether the principle was sound. Brick held heat. Her father had shown her. The kiln was brick. If she could seal it, control it, and feed it just enough flame to charge the walls, not to warm the air, but to warm the stone, then the stone would warm the air after the flame died. She would not need a stove. She would not need 6 cords. She would need clay, scrap, patience, and enough fuel to keep coals alive. That evening, Clara Moan appeared at the kiln mouth. Clara was 31, a seamstress and laundress who lived with 2 children in a board cabin 300 yards down the gulch. Her husband had gone to Deadwood for work 8 months ago and sent money twice, then stopped. Clara survived by sewing and washing for the mine crews, and she recognized Marin's position because it was a more advanced version of her own. She was not cruel. She was frightened, for Marin and for herself, because Marin's failure would confirm what Clara feared about her own future. She brought a tin of biscuits and a question. "If that place was made for fire," Clara said, "why is there no stovepipe? Where will the smoke go? Where will the bad air go?" Marin told her. She would heat the brick, vent smoke through the crown hatch while the fire burned, then close the draft to a finger width and sleep on stored warmth. She would build a raised cot so she was above the cold floor, but below the smoke line. She would hang wet cloth at the doorway to test draft pull. If the cloth blew inward too hard, the kiln was drawing too much air and she needed to seal more. If smoke hung low instead of rising to the hatch, she needed to open the vent and wait. Clara listened. Then she said, "And if you're wrong? If the smoke stays low and you're asleep?" "Then I die warm instead of cold," Marin said. Clara did not smile. She set the biscuit tin on a broken firebrick and walked back down the gulch in the failing light. Marin ate 3 biscuits, saved the rest, and began scraping slag from the floor with a piece of iron strapping. The risk calculation was explicit, and she did not hide from it. A cabin she could not build was certain death. A kiln she might adapt was uncertain survival. The difference between certain and uncertain was the only margin she had, and she chose it the way a drowning person chooses a plank that might not float, not with confidence, but with the knowledge that the water was already over her head. The next morning, Ruel Marden came to the kiln. Marden was 46, the storekeeper and informal freight broker for Iron Creek. He controlled credit. In a camp where cash was scarce and winter supplies moved on account, controlling credit meant controlling who ate and who did not. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing. He carried his power in ledger lines and in the knowledge that every family in Iron Creek owed him something. He wanted Marin gone, not from malice, or not only from malice. Anders's $4 debt gave Marden leverage. If Marin abandoned the camp, her debt became uncollectible, but the mine company's debt to Marden for unpaid freight services was a separate matter he could press. More importantly, if Marin left the kiln yard, Marden could petition the mine receiver to sell the abandoned brick for salvage. Good firebrick had value. A widow squatting in a kiln complicated his claim. He arrived while Marin was hauling a sheet of scrap tin from the assay shed wreckage. He watched her drag it across the frozen ground, leaving a bright scratch in the frost. "Mrs. Vangen," he said, "I've come to discuss your account." "I owe $4, she said without stopping. "You owe $4, and your husband owed $9 to the boarding house. Polk has assigned that debt to me as a courtesy. You owe $13. She stopped dragging the tin. "Polk cannot assign my husband's debt to me. I did not sign the boarding agreement." "You ate the meals. You slept in the room. As his wife, not as his debtor." Marden smiled. It was not a warm expression. "Mrs. Vangen, I'm not a lawyer, and neither are you. What I am is the man who holds your trunk, your clothing, your Bible, your husband's effects. They remain in my storeroom until the account is settled. I have also written to the mine receiver about the use of company property." He nodded toward the kiln. "This is not your land. These are not your buildings." "They're not yours either," Marin said. "No, but I know whose they are, and you do not. That is a kind of ownership." He offered to buy Anders's brass work tag for 25 cents and forgive $1 of debt. The tag was stamped tin. It had no value except as proof that a man had worked and died in a particular hole in the ground. Marin refused. Marden told her that debt could follow a person farther than weather, and he walked back toward his store. Hiram Doxey had been standing near the ore cart track during this exchange. He did not speak. He did not defend Marin. He did not challenge Marden's arithmetic. He looked at the ground, and then he walked away, and his silence was worse than Marden's threat because it meant the one man in Iron Creek who understood her plan's impossibility also understood her position's impossibility, and he had chosen not to stand between the two. Clara Moen watched from the road. She said nothing either. Marin knelt at the kiln's draft door and resumed packing clay into the cracks where iron met brick. She used her bare thumb because she had no trowel. The clay was cold enough to sting. The gossip moved faster than the weather. Marden seeded it. At the store stove that evening, the only public gathering point in Iron Creek, he said Marin had taken lodging in a chimney. The men laughed because the image was absurd. A woman crawling into a soot-black dome where charcoal had burned, setting up housekeeping where 30-cord fires had roared. It was the kind of story that improved with telling. By the next morning, someone had added that she was burning furniture. By the following day, someone else claimed she had tried to buy a stovepipe and been turned away because the pipe would not fit the hatch. None of it was true. All of it was believed. The women were quieter. They understood that a woman without a room had fewer choices than a man without a room, and that the gap between those choices could be measured in the kinds of offers that arrived after dark. But even the women who understood whispered that grief had turned Marin's mind. Moving into a kiln was not resourcefulness. It was a symptom. The judgment became practical. No one in Iron Creek would sell Marin stovewood on credit. The few women who did piecework laundry did not refer overflow to her. Boys from the livery threw frozen horse dung through the kiln's draft door one afternoon while she was hauling creek clay, and when she returned to find the mess on her cleared floor, she cleaned it in silence because complaining required an authority she did not possess. Someone, she never learned who, stole a coil of wire she had scavenged from the assay shed wreckage, wire she had planned to use for hanging blankets inside the kiln's entry arch. Community contempt was not abstract. It removed resources. Every person who laughed was a person who would not trade. Every whisper was a door that closed before she could knock on it. The town's judgment operated like weather, impersonal, constant, and erosive. Marin continued because she had discovered something about shame that only the truly cornered learn. Shame is survivable. Exposure is not. She could endure being called foolish. She could not endure another night in the ore shed with wind pouring through the planking. The kiln, for all its absurdity, gave her something the laughter could not take away. Walls thick enough to block the wind, a floor drier than the frozen ground, and a project that demanded her hands and her mind during the hours when grief would otherwise have her sitting still until the cold finished its work. She began collecting what others ignored. Willow switches from the creek bank, thin and flexible, useful for binding cloth baffles. Broken firebricks scattered in the yard, still dense enough to hold heat. Clay from the exposed bank where spring runoff had cut a seam of workable gray earth. Scrap hinges from the assay shed door, rusted but functional. Torn flour sacks discarded behind the store. Stove ash from the bunkhouse dump, mixed with horsehair from the livery floor. A crude mortar her father had used to patch the Wisconsin bakehouse. Each piece was worthless. Together they were the beginning of something she could not yet name and the town could not yet see. She hauled them to the kiln in armloads, in her apron, in the cracked coffee pot. She sorted them on the floor she had cleared. She worked until her hands cracked from the cold, and then she wrapped them in strips torn from her second dress and worked again. The days shortened. The temperature dropped 3 degrees on Wednesday and held there through the weekend. Snow crusted hard enough to walk on without breaking through, and the creek began to ice at the edges where current slowed. Winter was not arriving, it had arrived. The question was no longer whether it would be bad. The question was how bad, and how soon, and whether the walls of a dead charcoal kiln could hold enough heat to keep one woman's blood moving when the worst of it came. Marin knelt at the draft door each evening and pressed her palm against the brick where she had packed clay that morning. The clay held. The gaps narrowed. The wind noise inside dropped by a register she could hear. She did not know if it was enough. She did not know if anything she was doing would matter when the temperature fell past 0 and stayed there for days. But she was building. She was sealing. She was learning the kiln's body the way a rider learns a horse, by touch, by repetition, by paying attention to what the animal offered and what it refused. The kiln refused to be a cabin. She did not ask it to be one. She asked it to be what it already was, a vessel built for heat, and to hold a smaller fire than it had ever known, not for charcoal, but for a woman who had nowhere else to go. The creek clay froze in her coffee pot overnight. She thawed it against her body each morning before she could pack another section of gap. Progress was measured in inches, in thumb widths of sealed crack, in the slow quieting of wind through brick. It was not dramatic. It was not fast. It was the work of a woman who had been told the math was impossible and who had decided to change the math. And 3 miles south, the weather that would test every sealed joint and every packed crack was already building over the open plains, invisible and patient, waiting for the warm morning that would make everyone believe the worst was over before it struck. Jory Tregartha arrived on the 7th day, and he arrived because of smoke. Marin had built her first test fire that morning, A handful of dry willow bark and 2 charcoal fines the size of her fist set in a cleared patch at the center of the kiln floor. The fire was small, pathetically small. It produced more smoke than heat, and the smoke did exactly what she feared. Instead of rising cleanly to the crown hatch, it spread laterally, filling the dome like fog in a bowl. She opened both draft doors. The smoke moved, but slowly, grudgingly, as if the kiln remembered a time when fire meant something, and this insult did not qualify. She was coughing, eyes streaming, crouched at the lee side door with her face near the ground where the air was still breathable, when she heard boots on the frozen yard and a voice that carried the flat vowels of Cornwall. "You have the doors wrong," the voice said. She turned. A man stood silhouetted in the draft door, short, barrel-chested, white-haired, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone as the kiln. He was 64 years old, though she would not learn that for 3 more days. His name was Jory Tregartha, and he had built kilns like this one in Nevada, Wyoming, and the Black Hills before coal and coke made local charcoal worthless and made him worthless with it. He stepped inside without asking permission. He looked up at the crown hatch, then down at her fire, then at the draft doors. He lit a twist of tow from his pocket, a slow-burning hemp fiber used for testing airflow in mine shafts, and held it at arm's length. The smoke from the tow curled toward the crown, then bent sideways, then reversed, and streamed out the windward draft door. "This place remembers being fed," Jory said. "Both doors open, and the wind decides which way the air moves. Close the windward door. Leave the lee. The hatch pulls, but only if you give it one direction to pull from." Marin closed the north-facing door. The effect was immediate. Smoke that had been pooling at shoulder height began to thin. The tow stream straightened. Air entered through the lee side draft, crossed the fire, heated, rose, and exited through the crown hatch. The kiln was drawing. Not strongly, the fire was too small to create real convection, but the air had found a path. Jory watched for a full minute without speaking. Then he crouched beside the fire and held his palm 6 inches above the coals. "How long has this been burning?" he asked. 20 minutes, maybe less." He pressed his palm to the floor brick 2 feet from the fire, then 4 feet, then at the wall. He stood and pressed the wall at shoulder height. He did this the way a doctor examines a patient, systematically, without expression, gathering information before diagnosis. "The floor is taking heat," he said. "Slow. The wall is not. Not yet. Your fire is too small and too brief. The brick needs time. Hours, not minutes. You must think of this floor as a bank. You do not fill a bank with 1 coin." "I cannot keep a large fire," Marin said. "I have no stove. I have no chimney. Only the hatch." "You do not need a large fire. You need a patient one." He sat down on the kiln floor, cross-legged, as if he intended to stay. He picked up 3 stones from the rubble near the wall, one the size of his fist, one the size of a loaf, and one as large as a water bucket. He placed them at different distances from the coals. "Watch," he said. They sat in the dim kiln for an hour. Marin fed the fire with willow bark and small charcoal pieces, keeping it no larger than a wash basin. Jory did not help. He watched. At intervals, he touched each stone. After 20 minutes, the fist-sized stone was hot on the surface facing the fire and cold on the back. After 40 minutes, the loaf-sized stone was warm through, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air. After an hour, the bucket-sized stone was barely warm on the fireside and cold everywhere else. But when Jory pulled the fist-sized stone away from the fire and set it on the floor, it cooled in minutes. The loaf-sized stone moved the same distance, stayed warm far longer. The bucket-sized stone had barely started. "Small and thin heats fast and loses fast," Jory said. "Large and thick heats slow and keeps. Your walls are the largest and thickest stone you will ever own. Give them a full day of coals and they will give you a full night of warmth. That is the trade. Patience for survival." "How do you know this?" Marin asked. "Because I spent 11 years feeding kilns that did the same thing with 30 cords instead of a handful. The physics do not change with the scale." only the time. He told her his history in fragments over the next 3 days, not as biography, but as context for the things he taught her. He had come to America from Cornwall at 19, following tin miners who became charcoal men when the western smelters needed fuel. He had built and tended beehive kilns at Eureka, Nevada, and at Piedmont, Wyoming. The great charcoal yards where kilns stood 30 feet across and 30 feet high and burned for 10 days at a stretch. He knew how masonry behaved under heat because he had lived beside it for years, sleeping in lean-tos against kiln walls that stayed warm through December nights, while the men who slept in wooden bunkhouses woke to frost on their blankets. He had not sought Marin out. He had seen smoke from a kiln he knew was abandoned and come to investigate because old charcoal men did not ignore smoke from cold kilns. What he found was not a squatter or a vandal. What he found was a woman on her knees reading the kiln the way he had once read kilns, studying draft, testing surface, cataloging damage. He recognized competence, not expertise. Competence. The difference between someone who understands a problem and someone who is merely standing near one. His first full teaching took an entire afternoon. Draft. He showed Marin that the crown hatch pulled strongest when both doors were open because the kiln became a chimney with two mouths. Close one mouth and the pull halved. Close both and the pull died, but so did the air. The solution was not fully open or fully closed. The solution was controlled restriction. Together, they fitted the south draft door with a clay-packed frame that narrowed the opening to a gap 2 fingers wide at the bottom and sealed everywhere else. The north door they sealed completely with clay, horsehair mortar, and a double layer of flour sack pressed into the gaps. Jory tested the seal with his toe twist. No smoke escaped through the north door. All air entered through the south gap, crossed the fire zone, rose, and exited through the hatch. Now the kiln sips, he said. Before, it gulped. You cannot heat a room that is breathing like a bellows. His second teaching, the next day, was heat path. They built a proper fire zone, a ring of dense firebrick salvaged from the assay furnace, set on edge to contain ash and direct radiant heat downward into the floor. Jory insisted the ring be no larger than a washtub. Marin wanted it wider. They argued the first real friction between them, and it mattered because it was not about fire. It was about fear. Marin wanted a larger fire because a larger fire felt safer. Jory told her a larger fire would consume fuel she did not have, produce smoke she could not vent, and heat the air instead of the brick. Air is a thief, he said. You warm it and it leaves through every crack. Brick is a vault. You warm it and it holds. Feed the vault, not the thief. She yielded because his logic matched her father's memory, and because she could see, after 2 days of small fires, that the floor bricks nearest the fire zone were perceptibly warm to the touch, while the air 3 feet away remained cold. The heat was going somewhere. It was going down, into stone. His third teaching was sealing without smothering. They spent 2 days on this alone, and it nearly killed their partnership because Jory wanted to close the crown hatch entirely between fires, and Marin refused. She had listened to Clara's question, "Where will the bad air go?" And she would not sleep in a sealed stone chamber with residual smoke. Jory respected the fear. He did not dismiss it. Instead, he helped her build a solution. They repaired the crown hatch plate with scrap tin riveted over the gaps, then attached a hinged pole, a lever made from an ore sled runner that allowed Marin to push the hatch plate open or closed from the floor without climbing the icy dome exterior. Open during burning, smoke rose and exited. Closed between burns, heat stayed in the walls. Cracked open at night, just enough exchange to prevent stale air from pooling while the brick radiated warmth. They hung a wet cloth strip at the south draft gap. If the cloth blew inward more than a hand's width, the kiln was drawing too much cold air, and the gap needed narrowing. If smoke gathered below the cot line instead of rising to the hatch, the draw was too weak and the hatch needed opening. These two indicators, cloth and smoke height, became Marin's instruments. She checked them the way a sailor checks wind, constantly, instinctively, without conscious thought after the first week. The cot came next. Jory helped her build a sleeping platform from ore sled runners and salvaged planking, raised 18 inches above the floor. The position was deliberate. Cold air pooled at the floor. Smoke gathered at the dome. The band between roughly 12 to 48 inches above the brick was the warmest and cleanest zone during radiant heating. The cot placed her body exactly where the physics were most favorable. They laid a base of dry willow switches on the plank's surface, then flour sacks stuffed with straw. Jory had traded from the livery in exchange for repairing a cracked wheel hub. The bedding was crude. It was also dry, elevated, and positioned in the thermal sweet spot of a 28-foot masonry dome. Maren lay on it the first evening and felt, for the first time since Anders died, something other than cold. Progress had a rhythm now. Each day, Maren added to the kiln's conversion, while Jory supervised and taught. Day 1, clear old ash and glass slag from the floor. Maren worked 12 hours on her knees with an iron scraper. Day 3, seal the north draft door completely. Clay froze in her coffee pot and had to be thawed against her body each morning. Day 5, build the raised cot from ore sled runners. Jory showed her how to lash joints with wire instead of nailing, because nail holes in the runners would split the dry wood. Day 7, hang wool and flour sack curtains inside the entry arch. Clara Moen left a bundle of torn petticoats at the kiln mouth without speaking. Maren sewed them into a double-layer baffle that reduced the draft gap's wind by half. Day 10, complete the crown hatch lever. This took 3 attempts. The first lever bent under the hatch plate's weight. The second held but jammed when frost expanded the hinge pin. The third, built with a wider fulcrum and greased with tallow, worked. Day 12, test the first full coal bed. Maren burned willow and charcoal fines for 6 hours, then raked the coals flat, closed the hatch to a crack, and waited. The floor bricks near the fire zone were too warm to hold a palm against. The wall at shoulder height was noticeably warmer than the air outside. At midnight, the air inside the kiln was cold but not bitter. Frost did not form on the entry curtain. It was not comfort. It was distance from death, measured in degrees. Setbacks arrived with the regularity of weather. A thaw on day 8 turned creek clay to gray soup. Maren had hauled 2 buckets to the kiln for mortar work. The temperature dropped overnight and froze the clay solid before she could pack it into the remaining wall cracks. She spent day 9 chipping frozen clay from the buckets and warming small handfuls against her stomach under her dress until they were pliable enough to press into gaps. She sealed 8 inches of mortar crack that day. She had 40 more inches to go. On day 6, she split her right thumb to the bone on a tin edge while cutting a hatch patch. Jory cleaned it with whiskey, his own, from a flask he carried for precisely this purpose, and bound it with a strip of boiled cotton. She lost 2 days of fine work because the thumb swelled and would not grip. On day 9, Martin refused to sell lamp oil when Maren came to the store with coins in hand. He did not say she was denied. He said the oil was spoken for. She left without arguing and burned twisted willow bark for light, which smoked badly and gave a third of the illumination. She worked by feel after dark, packing mortar by touch, testing seal by the sound of wind through gaps. On day 11, Clara's boy came down with a cough that Clara feared would turn to pneumonia. Clara could not spare the rags she had promised Maren for wall chinking. Maren did not blame her. She tore strips from her own second dress, the one she had been saving, and used them to pack 2 remaining gaps in the south door frame. She now owned 1 dress, 1 blanket, and the clothes she stood in. Hiram Doxey reappeared on day 10. He had not returned since their first confrontation, and Maren expected another lecture. Instead, he stood at the draft door and watched the crown hatch lever work. Maren pulled the rod from below. The hatch plate lifted cleanly, held, and sealed again when she released. "Counterweight?" Doxey asked. "Fulcrum and a stone," Jory said from inside. "She designed it. I held the tin." Doxey looked at the sealed north door, the narrowed south gap, the cloth indicator, the raised cot, the fire ring. He pressed his palm to the floor brick and held it there. "It's warm," he said. He sounded surprised. Surprised and irritated, the way a man sounds when the math he trusted begins to shift. It's been warm since day 8, Marin said. Warm is not winter, Mrs. Vangen. Warm on a 20-degree day is not warm on a 20-below night. You have sealed an oven. You have not yet sealed it against anything that matters. He dropped 2 cracked fire bricks from the assay furnace at the kiln mouth. Waste anyway, he said, and left. Jory picked up the bricks and examined them. Dense, heavy, 2 hairline fractures but structurally sound. Good thermal mass. He gave you a gift, Jory said, and called it garbage so he would not have to explain himself. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see your work but not understand it? 3 days before the storm, the kiln was as ready as Marin could make it. The north draft door was sealed with clay, mortar, horsehair, and flour sacking, packed so tight that Jory's toe twist showed no leakage. The south draft door was narrowed to a 2-finger gap at ground level, with a removable clay plug for full closure during sleep. The crown hatch worked cleanly from below, open for venting, cracked for overnight exchange, sealed for maximum heat retention. The fire ring held its shape. The cot was dry and elevated. The entry arch had double curtains that Marin could cinch with a cord. Early tests were promising but incomplete. With a fire no bigger than a wash tub, willow, charcoal fines, and scrap wood burning low for 6 hours, the floor bricks near the center became too warm to hold a palm against. The wall at shoulder height warmed slowly, perceptibly, the heat arriving like a tide an inch at a time. At midnight, after the flame died and only coals remained, the air was cold but survivable under blankets. By dawn, frost had not formed inside the entry curtain. Outside, it coated every surface. Jory insisted she measure instead of hope. They hung a tin cup of water by the cot, another at the entry curtain, and a third outside on the iron door hinge. By morning, the outside cup was frozen solid. The entry cup had a skin of ice on the surface. The cot cup remained liquid. This was the first visual proof. Water that did not freeze. Not warm water. Not comfortable water. Water that existed in a state between freezing and not freezing because the brick around it was slowly, steadily releasing the heat Marin had put into it 6 hours earlier. Jory smiled. It was the first time Marin had seen him smile. "Your father's bakehouse," he said. "You have built your father's bakehouse." But the skeptics were not yet done with her. Clara came and looked at the liquid water in the cup and said that liquid water was not warmth, and a calm night was not weather. She was right. Doxy, told about the test, said much the same thing with more irritation. A kiln that performed in mild cold proved nothing about deep winter. Martin, when word reached him, said Marin was wasting time in company property and that he had written to the mine receiver. 3 threats converged on a single point. Marin's kiln might work in a test, but it had not faced anything real. The weather had been cold, but not severe. The wind had been steady, but not violent. The nights had been long, but not lethal. Everyone in Iron Creek, the skeptics, the gossips, even Jory, understood that the difference between a mild cold test and a deep winter storm was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind. A blizzard did not simply make things colder. It attacked. Wind found gaps that calm air ignored. Drifting snow sealed vents. Ice formed where moisture met metal. A structure that breathed comfortably in calm air could suffocate or freeze when wind pressed against every surface simultaneously. The morning of January 12th opened warm, strangely warm. Snow slid from the ore shed roof in wet clumps. Men at the stamp mill removed their mittens. The sky was overcast, but the air felt like late November, not mid-January. Children played in the gulch without coats. Clara hung washing on her line for the first time in weeks. Jory Tregartha did not remove his mittens. He stood in the charcoal shed where he had been sleeping and watched the sky with the expression of a man counting cards he did not like. He had spent 11 years reading weather by its relationship to kilns. Wet air meant slow burns, dry cold meant fast draws, and a warm morning after weeks of bitter cold meant the atmosphere was rearranging itself in a way that would end badly. He walked to the kiln. Marin was inside, sewing a patch on the entry curtain. "Bring your fuel inside," he said. "All of it, before noon." "It's warm out," Marin said. "Bring it inside." She had learned, in 2 weeks, to distinguish between Jory's opinions and Jory's commands. This was a command. She spent the next 3 hours hauling every piece of fuel from the yard into the kiln. Willow bundles she had tied with cord, charcoal fines stored in a crate, broken crate slats, dry dung chips she had collected from the livery, and a small sack of coal dust Jory had been hoarding. She stacked it against the interior wall opposite the fire ring, away from heat, but inside the sealed dome. By mid-morning, she had 3 days of fuel inside the kiln. Outside, the day remained mild. Boys threw snowballs. A freight wagon arrived at the store. The sky sat heavy and gray, but not threatening. By noon, wet snow began to fall. Soft at first, quiet, the kind of snow that children catch on their tongues. By mid-afternoon, the wind hit. It did not arrive gradually. The morning's warm air collapsed as a cold front struck from the northwest with a physical violence that made the word storm seem inadequate. One moment, wet snow fell lazily. The next, the air turned white, and the temperature dropped so fast that the wet snow froze to every surface it touched. Skin, wool, iron, wood. And the wind behind it drove ice crystals horizontally through the gulch with enough force to draw blood from exposed flesh. The Children's Blizzard. January 12, 1888. Across the Dakota and Nebraska plains, the sudden whiteout caught hundreds of people between shelters. Children walked out of schoolhouses into a wall of white and could not find the building again 30 feet behind them. Men froze between barn and house, following fence lines that ended in open prairie. The storm killed not through sustained cold, but through speed. The speed of its arrival, the speed of the temperature drop, and the absolute annihilation of visibility that turned familiar ground into featureless white in the time it took to cross a yard. In Iron Creek, the storm funneled through the gulch like water through a pipe. The stamp mill's tin roof peeled at the north seam. The ore shed, already leaning, lost 2 planks from its west wall. Marden's store shuddered as wind found every gap between boards and drove snow through them in fine lines that coated shelves, barrels, and the floor. Within 20 minutes of the wind's arrival, no one could see across the gulch. Within an hour, the drifts were waist-high against east-facing walls. Marin was inside the kiln when the storm hit. She heard it before she felt it, a sound like a freight train approaching from the north, followed by a pressure change that made her ears pop. The entry curtain blew inward and flattened against the cot frame. Snow burst through the 2-finger draft gap at the south door in a horizontal stream that crossed the floor and struck the far wall. She moved fast. She sealed the south draft gap with its clay plug, pressing it into place with both hands until no air came through. She pulled the entry curtain taut and cinched the cord. She checked the crown hatch, cracked open for air exchange, and felt the draw reverse as wind pressure above the dome forced air downward instead of pulling it upward. She closed the hatch completely. For the first time since she had converted the kiln, every opening was sealed. The silence inside was immediate and frightening. She could hear the storm, a sustained roar that vibrated the iron door plates, but it was muted, as if the world had moved 100 feet away. The kiln walls were 3 feet of brick and stone. The dome overhead was a continuous arch of masonry that had been built to contain combustion temperatures far beyond anything weather could produce. Wind that tore planks from the ore shed slid over the dome without finding purchase. Snow that drove through every gap in every board building in Iron Creek hit the kiln and stopped. She lit the fire. Willow bark first, then charcoal fines, then crate slats feeding a flame no larger than a wash basin. Smoke rose and stopped. Without the crown hatch open, it had nowhere to go. It spread at the dome, thickened, and began to drop. The smoke dropped below the cot line within 5 minutes. Marin's eyes burned. She coughed. The decision was brutal and immediate. Open the hatch and lose heat to the storm, or keep the hatch closed and fill the kiln with carbon. She cracked the hatch, not fully open, just a hand's width, and felt the wind above the dome snatch the smoke upward with such force that the flame in the fire ring bent sideways. The draw was too strong. Heat was leaving with the smoke. She pulled the hatch back to a finger width. Smoke rose slowly. The flame settled. The balance was razor thin, enough opening to vent smoke, not enough to vent warmth. She would adjust that gap 17 times in the next 24 hours. She was alone inside the kiln, feeding the fire, adjusting the hatch, pressing her hand to the floor every hour to feel the heat spreading through the brick, when she heard something outside that was not wind. Screaming. Clara Moen's voice, thin and shattered by the gale, coming from somewhere in the white darkness below the kiln yard. Maren went to the south draft door and pulled the clay plug free. Wind and snow exploded through the gap. She could see nothing. The storm was not a curtain. It was a wall, solid white, featureless, howling. She shouted Clara's name. The wind took the word and scattered it. Then she heard what Clara was screaming. A name. Nels, her youngest, 5 years old. He had run after the loose goat when the storm hit, and now he was gone somewhere in the gulch between the cabins and the creek. Maren closed the draft gap. She stood inside the kiln for 10 seconds. The fire burned. The walls were warm. The cot was dry. She could stay inside and survive. She could seal every opening and wait for the storm to pass and walk out in the morning to learn whether a child had frozen to death 50 yards from her door. She tied a rope to the iron ring of the south draft door. She looped the other end around her waist. She pulled on her coat and wrapped a flour sack around her face. Jory Tregartha appeared at the entry arch like a figure emerging from a wall of static. He was coughing. Hard, doubled-over coughs that sounded wet and deep. He had come from the charcoal shed 100 yards away by feeling along the ore cart track rail, and the effort had cost him. Snow caked his beard. His eyes were barely open against the ice. "The boy," Maren said. Jory nodded. He did not ask for details. He took the rope's free end and wrapped it around the ore cart post at the kiln mouth, creating an anchor point. Maren would go out on the tether. Jory would hold the line and keep it taut so she could follow it back. She went into the storm. The kiln disappeared in 4 steps, not 10, not 20. 4 steps, and the dome that had been her entire world for 2 weeks vanished into white. The rope pulled at her waist. She moved south, toward where the cabins should be, crawling because standing meant the wind knocked her sideways, and crawling kept her below the worst of the driven snow. She found the ore cart track rail by feel, iron under 2 inches of drift. She followed it south for 30 yards, rope paying out behind her. The cold was not something she felt on her skin. It was something that entered her lungs and made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. Her eyes froze shut every time she blinked. She wiped them with her sleeve, and the sleeve froze against her lashes. She found Nels by sound, not a scream, not a cry. A thin, irregular tapping, a mitten hitting wood. He had crawled under the overturned ore cart beside the track rail and was slapping the underside of the cart bed with the mindless repetition of a child too cold to think, but not yet too cold to move. She could not see him. She heard the tap, 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 and followed it to the cart and reached underneath and found a body so small and so rigid that for a horrible moment she thought he was dead. He was not dead. His mitten moved when she touched it. She pulled him out and pressed him against her chest under her coat and turned back along the rope. The return was worse. The wind was behind her now, which meant it pushed instead of resisted, and the push sent her stumbling off the rail twice. The rope was her lifeline. She followed it hand over hand, Nels pressed against her ribs, the boy's breathing shallow and fast against her collarbone. The rope led her to the ore cart post. The post led her to the entry arch. Jory's hands found her in the white and pulled her inside. Opening the door cost heat. Snow blew across the brick floor in a sheet. The fire guttered. Smoke dropped from the dome and filled the kiln at waist height. Maren sealed the draft gap with her body, while Jory pulled the curtain closed. The wind hammered the iron door plate so hard it rattled in its frame, and a gap she had not known existed, a hairline space between the upper hinge and the brick, whistled with a sound like a kettle. Inside. Cold air swirling, smoke layered, the fire nearly dead. Jory talked her through the sequence he had taught her. His voice was steady, but his coughing was worse, and between instructions he bent double and spat into the ash. "Crown hatch first," he said. "Open it wide. Let the smoke rise. You lose heat for 2 minutes, but you can breathe." She opened the hatch. Smoke roared upward. Cold air plunged down through the gap. The temperature inside dropped so fast her wet clothing began to stiffen. Now rake the coals flat. Every coal touching brick. Maximum surface contact. She raked with the iron scraper. Coals spread across the fire ring in a glowing bed, each one pressing heat directly into the dense fire brick beneath. Feed it. Slats first, then willow. Small pieces. Fast flame, fast heat. Don't wait for a bed. You need the walls charged now. She fed the fire. Flames rose. The brick floor drank the heat in a way that was almost visible. The surface nearest the coals darkened as moisture vaporized, and the warmth spread outward in a ring she could track by touching. Shut the hatch to a finger. South gap stays plugged. Lee vent stays at 2 fingers. The smoke settled into a manageable layer above her head. The air below the cot line was breathable, not clean, not comfortable. Breathable. She stripped Nels of his wet clothing, frozen breeches, soaked wool shirt, one mitten, one bare hand already white at the fingertips, and wrapped him in flour sacks that had been resting against the inner wall, warm from the brick behind them. Clara arrived minutes later, pulled to the kiln by the rope Jory had strung from the post. She was hysterical, snow-blinded, and shaking so violently that she could not hold her son. Marin placed Clara on the cot, placed Nels against Clara's body, and covered both with the wool blanket and every dry piece of cloth in the kiln. Clara tried to push the boy toward the fire. Marin stopped her. "Too close wastes heat. The wall is warmer than the air by the flame. Keep him against the wall." She had not planned to say that. It came out with the certainty of something she had learned so thoroughly it bypassed thought. Jory, sitting against the far wall coughing, heard her say it and nodded. She was teaching now, without intending to, because crisis compressed learning into action. If you're invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because this is the moment every warning, every insult, and every lesson has been leading toward. The storm did not relent. Hour after hour, the wind screamed over the dome and pressed against the sealed doors and hatch with a force that made the iron plates vibrate. Marin settled into a cycle. Feed the fire for 90 minutes, rake coals flat, seal the hatch, let the brick absorb for 2 hours, crack the hatch, check the cloth indicator, adjust. Feed again, rake again, seal again. The kiln performed. Not perfectly, not comfortably. But the physics that Tolif Vangen had pressed into his daughter's hand in a Wisconsin bakehouse and that Jory Tregartha had demonstrated with 3 stones on a kiln floor held true under the worst conditions the Dakota Plains could deliver. Hour 1 after the rescue. Opening the door had dropped the interior temperature severely. The walls were still radiating, but the cold air mass overwhelmed the output. Nels shivered on the cot. Clara wept. Hour 2. The fire rebuilt the coal bed. The brick floor began reclaiming heat. The air at cot level stabilized above freezing. Hour 6. The cot cup of water remained liquid. The entry cup froze. The floor bricks near the fire ring were too warm to touch with a bare hand. The wall at shoulder height was warm enough that Clara leaned against it and stopped shaking. Hour 10. Nels's color returned. His fingertips were damaged, white blisters that would peel but not blacken, but he was warm, dry, and asleep. Clara held him against the wall and stared at the brick behind her son's head, as if she had never seen brick before. Hour 12. Hiram Doxey arrived. He had come from the mine office following the ore cart rail to the kiln yard because the office stove was smoking backward. Ice had clogged the stovepipe cap, and the reverse draft was filling the office with carbon. He entered the kiln, stooped, snow-crusted, and breathing hard. He stood inside the door, removed his gloves, and held his hands toward the wall. Not the fire. The wall. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "How much fuel have you burned?" "2 willow bundles, crate slats, charcoal fines, less than half a sack of dung chips." "Since when?" "Since noon yesterday." He looked at the fire ring. The flame was barely there, coals glowing under a thin feet of willow bark, no larger than a dinner plate. He looked at the wall, where the warmth was coming from. He placed his palm flat against the brick and left it there. "My office burned a quarter cord since this morning," he said. "The stove is cold. The pipe is clogged. The wind comes through every seam." He did not say she was right. He did not say he was wrong. He sat down on the floor near the wall and closed his eyes, and the act of sitting, of choosing to remain in a charcoal kiln instead of returning to a building with a stove and a door that locked, was a verdict more honest than any words. Someone nearly died without the kiln. Orrin Bell, a freight hand who worked the mule teams between Iron Creek and the railhead, was found half-conscious under a tipped freight wagon in the yard. He had tried to reach the livery when the storm hit, and the wagon had blown over, pinning his leg and burying him under drift. 2 miners dragged him free and carried him not to the store, which was crowded, leaking wind, and lit only by a stove that smoked, but to the kiln, because it was the only place in Iron Creek with dry, radiant warmth, stable air, and no roof to lift. Marin treated his frostbitten ear and fingers with warm flour sacks and positioned him against the wall between Clara and the draft door, where the air was cleanest. Orrin wept, not from pain, from warmth. He had been in the storm for over an hour and had accepted that he was dying, and now he was lying against a brick wall that felt like a living thing, giving back heat that a woman had put into it with willow sticks and patience. Hour 18. The fire had consumed less than 1 armload of fuel total. The brick shell was fully charged, absorbing and re-radiating in a cycle that sustained itself with minimal input. Marin added a handful of charcoal fines every 2 hours. That was all. Hour 24. The storm still howled above the dome. Marin cracked the crown hatch and heard wind shriek across the opening. She closed it. The kiln remained sealed, warm, and breathable. Outside, the temperature had fallen past 20 below zero. Inside, the air at cot level held above freezing. The dome shape saved them from the storm's most destructive weapon, lateral wind force. Flat walls caught wind like sails. Board cabins lost shingles, planking, and entire wall sections. The assay shed, already half collapsed, finished the job and went flat. Marden's store flexed and groaned and lost its front shutters. But the kiln was a curve. Wind that hammered flat surfaces slid over the dome the way water slides over a stone in a creek. No roof seam to catch, no flat face to push against, no stovepipe to tear free. The kiln did not fight the storm. It gave the storm nothing to grip. Marin sat through the night with her back against the wall and her hand resting on the brick behind her. She could feel the heat in the stone. Slow, deep, patient, exactly as her father had described and exactly as Jory had demonstrated and exactly as the physics demanded. A small fire filling a large stone, and the stone having nowhere to spend it except back into the air that held the people she had pulled from the white. Jory sat across from her, coughing, wrapped in his coat, watching the smoke line to make sure it stayed above the sleeping bodies. He did not speak. He did not need to. The kiln was speaking for both of them in the language of stored heat, and the storm outside was the question to which every sealed crack and every packed joint was the answer. The storm broke on the morning of the 14th, not gently. The wind simply stopped, the way a voice stops mid-sentence, and the silence that followed was so absolute that Marin thought for a moment she had gone deaf. Then she heard the tick of settling snow against the iron door plate and the slow drip of meltwater from the crown hatch where the tin patch had warmed enough to loosen ice, and the sound of Clara's boy breathing steadily against his mother's shoulder. She opened the south draft gap. Light entered, white, flat, and blinding. The world outside was unrecognizable. Drifts stood 4 feet high against the east-facing walls of every structure in the gulch. The ore shed had lost its remaining west planks and stood open to the sky like a broken rib cage. The assay shed was flat. Marden's store had a drift inside the front door that reached the counter. Stovepipes leaned at angles. Roof boards lay in the snow like scattered playing cards. The kiln stood black, squat, and whole. Not a crack in the dome, not a shifted stone. Snow had packed against the windward base and swept clean over the top, leaving a crescent of bare brick on the lee side where the curve had deflected the drift. The iron door plates were frosted but seated. The crown hatch plate held. The building looked exactly as it had before the storm, minus 2 weeks of soot. The wind had scoured the exterior brick clean on the north face, exposing the original reddish color underneath. Maren did not celebrate. She fed Nell's warm water heated on the last coals, and helped Clara wrap the boy in dry cloth for the walk back to their cabin. Orrin Bell stood on his own, tested his frostbitten fingers, and walked to the livery without speaking. Doxy left first, headed for the mine office to assess damage. Jory remained inside the kiln, coughing against the wall. The town emerged slowly. Men dug out doorways. Women swept snow from kitchen floors where it had blown through wall seams. Children stared at drifts taller than their fathers. And one by one, over the course of that first day, people walked up the ore cart track to the smelter yard and stood outside the kiln and looked at it. They looked at it the way people look at something they have passed 100 times and never seen. The kilns had been ruins, industrial waste, evidence of a venture that failed. Now, one of them was the only structure in Iron Creek that had come through the worst blizzard in memory without losing a board, a shingle, or a life. Hiram Doxy returned at noon. He did not come alone. He brought Anson, a Norwegian miner who had lost half his cabin's north wall during the storm and spent the night huddled with his wife and 3 children around a stove that could not draw because the pipe was clogged with driven snow. He brought Margaret, a German widow who ran the laundry boiler and whose drying shed had collapsed. He brought them to the kiln the way a man brings skeptics to evidence, not to argue, but to show. Doxy knelt at the kiln floor. He placed his palm flat on the brick near the fire ring. The coals had been dead for 2 hours. The brick was warm. He moved his hand to the wall at shoulder height. Warm. He moved to the entry arch, where the curtain hung limp and frost-free. The air was cool, but not cold. Not bitter. Not the killing cold that sat in every board building in Iron Creek, where stoves had gone out and walls had leaked. "I told you an oven would kill you," Doxy said. He did not look at Maren when he said it. He looked at the brick under his hand. "I did not know it could be taught to keep house." He stood. He turned to Anson and Margaret.